This Vision 2020 Quality Schools in Every Neighborhood report is on specifically LCAP Goal 1, which is closing the achievement gap, and we're focused specifically in this report on reading and readers. And because we know that we actually cannot and will not close the achievement gap unless and until we have all students reading powerfully, reading on grade level. We know the prediction of third grade reading in particular, what can happen if students can't read, and more importantly, it's not just about being able to read, but choosing to read, and reading not just for reading's sake or reading for a reading assessment, but reading because to read and write and contribute and participate actively in our communities. Literacy is at the heart of that. And so this district has been committed to literacy and to work in literacy for a long time. We're doing well by some definitions in literacy. When you look statewide, we're second in the state within the large urban districts. Of the 15 large districts in the state, we're number 2 in literacy in third grade. So you would say, okay, well, that seems fine, and yet that's not, there's more. There's only Capistrano and Orange County does better than we do, but being second or being third is not good enough, and there's work that we need to do, and it's not good enough for our students. And so specifically tonight we're going to talk about where we are in our reading work. We're going to talk about a systemic approach, the systemic approach that's necessary so that we can continuously work to focus on strong literacy practices. It's not just about reading on grade level, although that's part of the report, but what does it take to put this in an equity context to make sure that each one of our schools and each and every one of our students are supported at the highest level, and what it's going to take to do that. We talk about teaching reading and about teaching a student to be able to read is one thing. We talk about being literate and being actively literate. And so you folks can talk about being illiterate, meaning you can't read or you don't know how to read. You can talk about students being literate. They can read, they can decode the words on the page, but we talk about being actively literate, contributing, participating members of our community, and we talk about voice and agency and being able to participate in a process where you're making a contribution in your classroom, in your school, in your community, in the world. And when we speak of literacy, we don't just talk about reading and writing. It's mathematics, it's science, it's social literacy. There's many forms of literacy, but it begins with the ability to being able to read, make sense, and read powerfully and make sense of the word and the world. And so we want our students leaving our system being actively literate, not just being able to read, but we hope that they go beyond just reading a simple, if all they're reading is a Twitter feed or a social media post or the comment or the comic section or the sports section. Are we actually reading across multiple genres? Are we reading for multiple purposes and audiences? Are we writing for multiple purposes and audiences? Are we using our literacy skills beyond just a reading assessment that's coming along once a year or coming along in a classroom? Are our teachers equipped to be able to give reading assessments and understand the meaning with which the students are making sense of the words and of the text that they're reading, and they're able to participate in critical thinking and critical discourse around that? So we put this Vision 2020 report in place because we know that when we're addressing closing the achievement gap, reading has to be at the core of that. And I've asked 2 of our team members to come up and present tonight where we currently are and what our systemic approach is going to be, because second is fine, but it's not good enough. And when we see third grade reading at 56% of our students being proficient right now, there's work to be done, and we can celebrate where we are, and then we can talk about our next steps in a systemic approach. So with that, I have Donna and Wendy to help me present.
Thank you for setting that powerful context. Good evening, everyone. Wendy and I are very excited to be here with you this evening and to share a short, but we hope very powerful report on the current status of reading in our district, and to offer you just some guideposts. We've organized this presentation in 3 stages. So we want to share some of the current data with you to show where our students are in terms of reading. We want to share with you the work that we're engaged in this year, and we want to preview the future with you and share some of the work that we're planning for next year as well. So we'll start with the data. In elementary schools, we continue to use the DRA as to indicate where our students are in their reading achievement within and across schools. This slide shows a 2-year comparison. The blue band is the percent of children reading at or above grade level as reported in the first reporting cycle. As you know, DRA is reported 3 times a year. The orange band shows the students reading at or above grade level expectations in that second reporting period. And you can see that we've laid next to each other the 2014-15 data and the 2015-16 data. So as you look across this slide, you can see that the percentage of children reading at or above grade level has improved. We are turning the dial incrementally, and this is cause for great celebration. It also gives us pause for reflection, because while 60% of our children are meeting or exceeding the grade level expectations, 40% of our children are not there yet. So we do have some work to do. In looking at the data for this instructional year across subgroups, we can see that almost every subgroup has performed better on the second cycle than they did on the first. And just to make sure you understand, this is sort of a moving target. It's not that children are reading the same books better, but children are reading harder books better. So again, this is cause for real celebration. We are turning the dial in the right direction. Everyone's performing better. But it also gives us pause for reflection, because we can see that disparity between subgroups still exists. So we have some work to do.
This is the presentation of the grade 5 data for Smarter Balanced Assessment, and that's one of the real challenges that we have in looking at where our students are in the area of reading at the secondary level. The only data that we have system-wide is the SBAC data. And so that poses some challenges, and we have some solutions that I'll be talking about as we move forward. But in looking at the current data that we have, grade 5 English Language Arts, the numbers up there at the top, you can see we're roughly, it's pretty close 50-50 with meeting standards and not meeting standards. We're stronger on the meeting standards by 54%. If you look down towards the bottom half of that slide under claim performance, specifically for reading, that 30% off to the side represents the students who are not meeting standards. And that 30% represents about 2,000 students in our grade 5 throughout our district that we really need to know a lot more than the SBAC data can provide us about what those students are doing in the area of reading. When we go to grade 8 in English Language Arts, you'll see that the percentage doesn't shift a whole lot. Still at the top, we're looking at about 50% above and 50% below. And again, that band at the bottom on reading, we have about 26% of our students not meeting standard in the area of English Language Arts. But our biggest challenge with secondary data and knowing where our kids are specifically in reading is just the limits of the data that we have. So switching to our second phase, the current work. What are we currently doing throughout our system to support our students?
Wendy, could you just explain what claim performance is?
The claim performance, so the English Language Arts assessment of SBAC has 4 claim levels, and at the bottom there you can see I don't know why they call it claim, that's how they describe the 4 portions of the SBAC in Reading Language Arts. The students take assessments in reading, writing, listening, and research and inquiry. And the scores at the bottom half of the slide are the sub-scores, and the scores at the top half of the slide are the total composite score, which is derived from a combination of the 4 claim levels below.
What's the difference between has not met the standard and overall score levels and below standard and claim?
That is the way that SBAC data, they report it out. They break it out at only 3 levels at the bottom, which is, yet again, one of the problematic areas of this, because you see that the not met and the nearly met, which in the top half of the slide are represented by the green and the yellow, then becomes collapsed into this gray band in the middle. So we don't really know how many of those kids are right at the edge of that gray band. We don't really know that since it got further collapsed. So it actually decreases the amount of information that we have about individual students and the amount of information that we have in order to inform instruction, which is what we really need to know.
Will you get further clarification going forward on this?
In terms of getting additional data that will tell us what kids need, yes. And we're going to talk more about how we plan to do that. Because right now, system-wide, what we have is the SBAC data.
And here again, this is a test score taken for a given group of students at a given time once a year.
Correct.
So we're making a lot of assumptions on just a one shot. And I'm also interested in knowing how, when it says nearly met, how near is near? Is it? Do we have a sense of? Is it just within within a standard of error, or?
It is within a standard of error, and I apologize, I don't know that off the top of my head, but how near is near? That's a great question. That's what we would like to know, and we also need to know a lot more about what the kids are doing in reading, because this assessment also doesn't tell us at what level kids can read instructional materials at their independent reading level, what level they can read at with support. So there's a lot of information that we don't have here.
So let's just be clear that we speak very frequently from resolutions to philosophical belief systems around how we engage in making sure students have the learning conditions to excel and to achieve. We already know the strengths and the weaknesses of a standardized assessment that's once a year. You just mentioned that, President McQuarrie, that we're not leaving this out of our report because it is part of our LCAP. It is part of the state and federal accountability system. Still at this point, we already know that there's been resolutions passed here and the belief system about how meaningful and relevant it is. We're not going to not include it because it is still part of the system. The meaningful, relevant data was the first slide where we talked about the reading assessment that teachers use in their classroom that gives you on-time feedback. So we can have if you want to talk about the SBAC and what a claim is and how close is nearly close or this close, we can have Aaron Gordon come and talk about our district testing coordinator can talk about the details of SBAC. This is one measure. It's only one measure. We continue to talk about it being only one measure, and there are very meaningful, relevant, on-time assessments that we use on an ongoing basis that are the formative assessments inside the classrooms that are most meaningful for students. So, we're not going to leave it out, as I said, but I want to talk about where we are, and when you do use this measure, this is where we are, second among 15 districts across the state, and we're still at our DRA level at 56% proficient, and we do have more work to do.
Yeah, I just, with regard to the SBAC or the CASP test, under California state law, do parents have the opportunity to opt their kids out of taking the state test?
Well, parents do have the right to opt out of that test. They do.
Okay, so under California state law, parents have the right to opt out their children from taking the SBAC, the CASP, federally mandated state test. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Do we have the percentage of the percentage of parents that exercise their right under California state law to opt out of the state test? Do we have any numbers on that for our school district?
Actually, Trustee Beiser, I'm going to interrupt because they might not be prepared to answer those questions, but I do. We do have that data.
We have the data?
Yes, we have
Okay.
it, but I don't have it because it wasn't part of tonight's presentation. But when I did present, I had by school, by cluster,
Okay, good,
the percent
good.
opting out, and your questions about
Can you just maybe send that memo to the board?
from
the
last year's
trustees?
data.
Yeah, sure, whatever data
Sure.
that you do have.
We can share that with you.
Right, and then I do know, I think I have heard from some parents that we send out a letter notifying parents of their right to opt out of state test this year?
That's always part of the annual communication to parents.
Okay. So, where would a parent go for research? Would they just Google the word opt out or hashtag opt out to learn about the opt-out movement and to decide whether or not this state test is the right thing for their children or not? Is that what parents might do?
I'm not, other than our communications that we send out centrally from the district, I don't know what other options are available for parents, but I'm sure that the assessment office knows that information.
Okay. But I mean in terms of information for parents, because, I mean, you know, we send them a letter that says you have the right under California state law to opt out of the test. You know, kids are talking about it. Kids don't have to take the test if their parents just write a note. And under California state law, there's no set form. It could be a note written on the back of a dirty napkin. And if a kid has that note under California state law, then the students don't have to take the state test at all. And so I'm just curious about that information and how parents can learn more and what our numbers look like as a district, and how many parents are you exercising their rights under California state law this year. So I look forward to getting some more of that data. Thank you.
That can be information that we can provide. It's not necessarily part of the staff's presentation this evening.
Sure, I understand, but since we were going over CASP data or SBAC data, I thought that maybe in the future we might want to talk about that as well. Thank you.
As a former researcher, I do appreciate the value of having collective data in the sense that it does give you some comparison tools that I think we want to keep in mind. It's not individualized, but it does give you the kind of measures that you can compare, and it gives you an indication of where we are relative to other folks. So we want to keep that thought in mind.
Yeah, but if you Google opt-out, there's 8 reasons why the opt-out movement is gaining steam nationwide. Millions of parents across the United States are opting their children out of these tests. And so I think that in order to allow parents to make an informed decision, giving the parents the information, you know, because we've been in a testing culture for, you know, since 2001 in our country, you know, federally mandated tests constantly, and then we get the data, you know, months after the assessment. So, and then sometimes it's very hard to do anything with it. It also doesn't necessarily follow the child. You're comparing one grade level of one group of students to a different grade level with completely different children. And you're comparing growth based on a different cohort. And so there's lots of flaws in this kind of federally mandated state testing. And so that's one of the reasons why the opt-out movement is growing. And parents all over the state of California are looking at the facts and the evidence and realizing that this assessment isn't necessarily the right thing for their children. And they're exercising their right under California state law to say, no, I don't want my child to participate in this state test.
I think we got it. All right.
So I know that you just reviewed the data that we currently have around reading and where we are as a district, and on 2 measures, one being maybe less valued than others on individual student information. Now, the plan going forward, what are our next steps given the current state of the data, specifically the reading data that we know is most meaningful to individual students?
What we're going to look at next is the current work that we're doing in reading. At the elementary level, I'm sure you're all well aware that we have several of these items. We have these items going on right now. The Lucy Calkins work with the units of study, the Rely resources that were presented at a previous board meeting, which are our professional development modules, and we're adding modules to the Rely library each week. And at the secondary level, we are looking currently at some common assessments so that we can go deeper than the data we currently have available with SBAC, looking at also developing interventions built within the student's day so that our students at the secondary level who are struggling are not just beholden to after-school tutoring or before-school tutoring, but there's actually interventions within their school day to bring up their skill level so that they will be ready for college and the career of their choice when they graduate. Of course, secondary is also working on the Rely resources, and the professional development component at secondary has been, we have 40 capacity builders at middle level and high school that are actually working on the curriculum alignment and coming up with some adjustments to our curriculum mapping, and that's being driven completely by a group of teachers that meet once a month.
So we want to unveil some of our thinking about potent next steps for next year. We have identified 5 leverage points that we believe will propel the work faster and deeper, so that next year when we sit before you, we can say that substantially more students are reading at grade level. We're going to walk you through each of these strategies. The number one variable that impacts student learning is teacher expertise. Research, this resonates across the research, and it's sort of common sense too. So we bear the responsibility and we have this opportunity to increase teacher expertise, and we will see a bump in student learning, reading in particular, if we pay attention to this. Teachers don't come to us as reading experts. You don't learn to be an expert in your teacher education program. This is on-the-job training, and it takes time, it takes lots of experience, it takes professional study and support to develop the expertise. We know that this is an area of tremendous weight, and we are prepared to vigilantly increase teachers' capacity to become expert reading teachers. We want to cast an ever brighter spotlight on formative assessments for the very reasons that have been shared this evening. We want to press forward on formative assessments, which are conducted in the course of instruction, and they provide immediate feedback that teachers can use to modify a lesson on the run. It can provide feedback on that would be useful in terms of planning. It certainly provides feedback on students' understanding and next steps, and provides opportunities for teachers to reflect on their practice. Given that we know that 40% of our children are not yet meeting grade level expectations, we need to wrap our arms around these struggling readers and make a difference in their lives. The best intervention strategy is prevention. So we want to continue to press on best first teaching. We want to make sure that we have expert reading teachers in TK, K, and 1, where children's reading careers are launched. We also want to make sure that we identify struggling students very early and that we provide immediate interventions. It is less difficult to untangle a confusion early in a reader's career. Once confusions linger, they become habitualized, and it becomes increasingly difficult to support these children. Our goal would be to, in some ways, put Wendy out of business. We don't think that any adolescents should go to our middle schools being struggling readers.
Describe what that looks like a little bit. How do we identify students who need support, early on, and what kind of support do we provide?
Yeah, the identification is not as tricky as you might think, because we're just going to sit next to a child and listen to them read, and we're going to analyze the reading strategies that a reader controls, almost controls, doesn't control at all, and make some professional determinations on what would be the most potent next steps for a reader. Those interventions can happen in small groups. They can happen, for our most struggling readers, they really need to happen one-on-one. Time is a precious resource, and we never seem to have enough of it. I'm pretty confident that we're not going to find an extra day in the week to offer up to teachers, nor are we going to find extra hours in the day. So it's incumbent on us to learn with and from each other how to use that instructional time in the most effective way. So we want to support the design of master schedules that are child-centered, instructional schedules that make sense to children. We want to make sure that we're providing time for best first teaching and strategic interventions in the course of the learning day, and time for teachers to study, to collaborate, to reflect. And this notion of committing the appropriate amount of time is not just at the school level, but it's at the leadership level as well. Our leaders have some learning to do, have some monitoring to do, and we have to assure that we're making a commitment to safeguard time for that work. So I've brought you through some of the content pieces that we know are leverage points and that will make a difference in the learning lives of our children. Want to move to the importance of leadership and the structural elements that will support this work.
I wanted to go back to the page 15. We know that collaboration and teacher collaborative efforts is important for developing skills and strength and teachers working together. And I'm wondering in what ways are teachers collaborating and what time during the day, or how is that being made? How is that possible?
I think it differs a little bit from site to site, but most of our schools have instructional leadership teams that meet regularly to help shape the work at the school, and teachers meet regularly in professional PLCs, professional learning, what does the C stand for? Communities.
And I think at the secondary level, we have a couple of other structures as well. One of the items that you see up there is that you've seen in the work that we're currently doing is the master schedule work. And the master schedule work is about making it student-driven, but also building time into the teacher's workday for collaboration so that they can talk about their practice, they can talk about their students, what their students need next. And that varies from site to site. That's really a leadership decision. Some schools organize at the secondary level. They may organize by department, they may organize by grade level. The one that makes my heart sing is when they cohort students, and they go across subject areas, because our kids need support in literacy across the subject areas. So, but it varies from school site to school site and how they organize that. At the secondary level, we also have the capacity builders. So there's one teacher from every middle school in English language arts, one from math, and at high school it's 2 for math and 2 for English, and they have a centralized PD day once a month. And they also have the same structures that Donna was mentioning with the PLCs and the ILTs. So there's a number of ways that they have that time built into their day.
Related to that, you've noted that certain schools have a lore and scores and so forth, right? Granted, they're not everything, but if you have more students at certain schools that are lower, if every school is getting the same treatment, then how will you ever close the achievement gap? So what are you doing to address that differential that you have there between schools to ensure that all the kids are getting what they need so that they can come up to speed?
So as we move to, we both have something to say here. As we move to our strategic plan for this coming year, it will be very much differentiated, that we will provide supports that are aligned to the needs of the children at that school. One of the proposals that we have is to train reading experts within our schools, within our district, who can provide immediate support to teachers and children. And these will be clustered in areas of greatest need.
And at the secondary level, we have identified with the area superintendents and the leadership team 5 priority clusters, and those are San Diego High, Morse, Lincoln, Hoover, and Crawford. And so those priority clusters are priorities for several reasons, and one of the big reasons is they represent almost 50% of the students in our district within those clusters. It's quite a few of our students, and there's a high degree of need there. So at the secondary level, we don't have, in the Common Core teachers, there's not a one Common Core support teacher for each cluster. So I have prioritized their work to stay in those cluster middle schools and high schools. So that's how we're tackling that for this school year. Okay, so shifting from what Donna has been talking about is the how we're going to get there. I'm going to be moving us. She was on the what. I'm shifting us to the how we're going to get there. And so our 5th leverage point really speaks to the issue of how do we develop coherence across this system so that we can do what Michael Fullen refers to as leading from the middle. So this slide 5, really the big idea on this slide is developing coherence across our system, and we're hoping to do that through literacy instruction. And on this second slide is our 6 action items. How will we get there? And your eye is probably drawn up to item 1. I'd like you to look down at number 6, because what these 6 action items are really looking at is how do we work at the classroom level. That is the heart and soul of our work, moving towards formative assessments, those assessments that are very close to the teacher and the student and are going to have the most impact on instruction. So that item 6 is moving towards those assessments that are right nearby the student and keeping a sharp eye on the progress that the students are making. So from 6, 5, and 4, it's those things we want to start at in the classroom and moving up, whereas the items 1, 2, and 3 are the central office supports coming down from the top, so that we create this lovely sandwich smack in the middle of what we're trying to accomplish, which is having an impact on student achievement. And that notion of listening from the classroom up and supporting from the top down is really what Michael Fullen will refer to as leading from the middle, and that's what we're trying to accomplish with these 6 action items. So they are threaded through with literacy as a thread, but if you'll notice on 6, 5, and 4, all of those steps are specifically about looking very carefully and keeping a watchful eye at the school level and with the students, and what are they doing, how do we know, what do they need next for their learning. And we're going to focus the support on literacy, but that really does impact all of the content areas as well.
And when Wendy talked about Michael Fullen's work, Leading from the Middle, he's written in a book called Coherence and other publications around specifically the LCAP in the state of California, that real change. He's studied what he calls the right drivers and the wrong drivers for change. And under No Child Left Behind, we saw a lot of the wrong drivers, a lot of the top-down accountability, punitive measures, look at using data as a hammer instead of as a flashlight. And our design approach here in these action items is we're not intending to overassess students. We're intending to use the formative assessments that are most meaningful for teachers. And we know that requires, when Wendy said from the top down, it's not top down in a top down kind of way. It's from the top we're going to support, and support comes in terms of to the greatest degree possible giving support and collaboration time to our teachers. When our teachers have time to collaborate and to work together in partnerships and talk about bringing meaningful real-time assessments from the classroom that give you feedback around what to do next with your students, that's how we end up changing outcomes for students, not in a once-a-year test. The once-a-year test is the byproduct, it's the autopsy, it's the after you do the right work every day using formative assessments, having time to collaborate and talk and learn. We need to have a systemic approach around improving and increasing our literacy practices, that we haven't had a systemic focus on literacy and literacy professional development, and that takes time, investment, collaboration time, and folks working together on that.
So, and I think it's embedded in what you're talking about, Superintendent, and so when we talk about creating time for teachers to collaborate, for teachers to develop expertise, what are we taking off of their plate to make sure that we're building that time to focus on what is most effective with students?
Well, in terms of what we're taking off the plate, I think that would be a question at the site level. But today, for example, I was out at Crawford all day working with their English teachers and trying to build the curriculum coherence. And I think one of the things we're taking off of their plate, quite frankly, is a bit of chaos. Trying to build some common threads so they can work together and be more effective. When I said, you don't all have to build these units of study. That's what we're currently working on. The idea that they can share that burden if they put into place some templates, for example, and they were choosing which one they wanted to use. And I can tell you by the end of the day, they were feeling like it was very doable and that they actually weren't going to have to work through their summer break, which is what they were thinking they were going to be doing this summer. And they realized, I have 2 more days with them before we break for summer, but they're actually now seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, that this is very doable. So I think what we are taking off the plate is a bit of chaos and anxiety about what comes next, and building in those supports and collaboration, which are not naturally a part of the professional life of a teacher. So.
One of the things that there was a discussion earlier, and Trustee Barrera just talked about it, how do you get that time for teachers? And that goes back to one of the parts of the Fight for Five that the teachers were advocating for was more enrichment classes for students. So one of the questions that we've talked about before is the Language Academy for a few years ran a pilot program where a group of art teachers would come in and take those students, they would take all the first grade students for 3 or 4 hours. And then they would teach them an art activity lesson. They would learn about Monet, and then they would make their own Monet painting. And while those children were, learning about Monet and Impressionist art and doing an art activity, those teachers were freed up for 3 to 4 hours to go and do some common lesson planning to try to ease their burden and give them time to prepare so they didn't have to stay at school until 7 or 8 o'clock at night doing those kinds of lesson planning and activities. And so I'm wondering, we had talked at this board level last year and the year before, and I know that the VAPA department is looking at how do we get art across the curriculum, especially in District E, to make sure that they have instrumental music and not just exploratory music, which is here's a triangle, as opposed to here's a flute, take it home and learn how to play the instrument. Have there been any conversations or discussions about any kind of pilot programs whereby teachers could get some of that free time to do some of the less common planning by grade level or cohort level?
Yes. So
we don't
could you
talk
elaborate?
about it at all. We don't care about that.
Yes, there is. And actually, just yesterday, we had our cross-department meeting, which is one thing that's very beneficial to get us out of our silos and how can we support each other. And Russ Sperling in the VAPA department is actually working to have substitutes who can come in when the teachers get release time, so it's not just the substitute coming in, but specific arts that they can focus on, and balancing out with the school to make sure that whatever arts program is coming in is something that's complementary to what they have. I only learned about that effort yesterday, so I can't speak to it, but I'm sure there's someone else who can.
But let me put this in the context of what we're discussing here is that we know that to fully implement these action items, the belief system behind the action items, the theory of action, is giving teachers appropriate time to collaborate and to use meaningful assessments. You're making a suggestion for how we should do that. At the board level and superintendent level in a discussion like this, I think that we're looking to have this conversation around, is there agreement here that we want that for our teachers? Having staff work on potential ways for how to do that can meet multiple board goals, including we have goals around VAPA and enrichment in the arts, and if we can get arts enrichment aligned to giving teachers more time for collaboration, wouldn't that be great? But that we're not actually specifically solving that tonight, but we are having conversations about how to best implement the vision that we're setting forth tonight, which is making sure there's collaboration time. There's not one way to do that. There are multiple ways, and the how and the implementation is for staff to figure out.
Yeah, I just think that if we had a pilot program at a school for a couple of years, that we would then debrief, did the pilot work, was it successful, how did it work, what's the feedback of the teachers, was it good for the children, did we accomplish a couple different goals in doing the pilot program, and then was the pilot good, are we going to expand it, was the pilot a failure? And we're going to try something different. And I know that pilot program at the Language Academy was a couple years ago, and and I know you and I, Superintendent Martin, have talked about it a couple of times over the last 3 years. And so I'm just kind of curious, just wondering, because you're saying we want to try to figure out ways to get teachers to have that time to work together.
Jim and Lindsay are both interested in having some comments right now.
Yeah, good. This is and so you heard about some of these opportunities that might come out yesterday, and so I look forward to exploring different ways to get teachers that planning time that they need. Yes, Mr. Sola.
Yeah, so I am working with SDA right now on exactly what you're talking about. So every site has been given teacher effectiveness money that they can spend to have VTs come in to release teachers to collaborate. What I'm working with SDA on right now is a cadre of visiting teachers from the VAPA department that would go into a school site and they would release the teachers, and they would do the lesson plans from VAPA. The teacher on site would not have to do the lesson plans, and they would have up to 3 hours of collaboration time. Yeah, so that's in the works right now.
So it sounds like that pilot program at the Language Academy is informing some of the things that we're looking at doing in the future.
Right.
Good, thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a couple of questions. First of all, on the issue of, you were talking about literacy, TK, K, and 1, and the whole developmental issue of kids, say from the age of 4 to 7, some kids come into kindergarten reading fluently, some kids are able to read by the end of 2nd grade, and I've seen in years past, I've seen parents and kids coming in who felt a lot of pressure because of standardized tests and so forth. In kindergarten and 1st grade, they weren't quite performing, and the teachers, very concerned about, the test scores and what's going on. So I'm wondering what sort of allowances are you making for that? Just as a parent, seeing that there were kids coming into kindergarten, as I said, who were totally fluent, and yet at the end of 2nd grade, there wasn't that much difference between a lot of the kids in terms of their reading level. And so how do you account for that everybody's not going to progress at the exact same rate, but that, say, around age 7 or something like that, they should be at that point?
So this notion that not all kids bloom at the same time is certainly something that we have to think about, but we don't want to assume that they're going to bloom later. We have to keep an eye on these kids who are not meeting developmental markers in terms of their reading development, and we have to investigate. We have to do an inquiry. We can't assume that 2 years from now they'll catch up. In fact, the research says the exact opposite, that kids who fall behind do not catch up. I think that the work we're asking kids to do is developmentally appropriate. The curriculum we've put in the hands of teachers is developmentally appropriate, but clearly children cannot be standardized, and they will respond to different stimuli, different instructional approaches, different instructional contexts at different rates. So again, it comes to teacher expertise. I have to know where this child is, and I have to, with whatever means I have available to me, nudge that child ever forward. My belief is every child must learn more today than they knew yesterday.
So I guess the other thing I'm wondering is, there may be a point, say in 2nd grade, 3rd grade, somewhere where we want students to be at a certain level as they've worked up to that point. For example, in high school, we want to make sure the students are getting their credits and progressing, and then obviously, like in the last year of high school, we have a lot of interventions for kids who are behind in credits and so forth. I mean, is there a point like that? And again, just as in high school and everything else, all the way along, but some sort of cutoff point where it's that if say, I'm just making these numbers up, but say at the end of 2nd grade, the student is not able to read at the level that he or she should be able to read, that there would be a more intense effort. In other words, not to go past, and I'm just making it what grade level, a certain grade, without, and I don't mean holding back either, but in terms of a real point where we say this, we don't want 70% of the kids to be, proficient at this point. We want all of them to be proficient at that point. And is there some sort of cutoff like that where we would say, we're doing all these preventive things along, and now we can't just keep moving along all these years, but we need to really do something special at that point?
So the benchmark years for reading development, according to researchers, is 1st grade and 3rd grade. 1st grade because we can clearly identify the markers that would show normal development and the markers that would show abnormal development. Reading recovery is not something we're currently doing in our district, but their efforts are targeted at 1st grade, respecting that as a critical benchmark in a child's reading development. The other year to pay attention to is grade 3, because the research shows that children who are behind at grade 3 are 4 times more likely to drop out of high school.
Right. So that would be a crucial, I mean, again, it's preventive, but it's still a crucial intervention point. And then the other thing...
May I add that I think the crucial year is the very beginning of school, because this is when children acquire the foundations to all that will follow.
Right.
If we
but
get
we
kids
still
launched,
have, but we have right now, we've got, we have 40% or some of the kids who are not there, and I understand that you're saying that is to prevent, and obviously what you're doing in the secondary level, we don't want to do that later. But there still has to be a point where we say you can't go further in some way unless we have really gotten you to a certain level.
But the language I might use is we can't ignore this problem any longer. We have to intervene now, we have to intervene strategically, and we have to monitor the results of that intervention. And again, those critical markers, research would show, would be first grade and third grade.
And then besides the technical issues of learning to read, there's also this other issue of that I don't see and hear about the love of reading and inspiration and you know, kids really being motivated and excited about it. And I've said before, sometimes I think that comes about through, a lot of times through volunteers and reading helpers and things like that, whether it's grandparents or whatever, that are just sitting down with kids and reading stories and so forth and so on. And I would be curious if there is research about that sort of instilling that love of reading. I mean, obviously, kids come from home backgrounds where they're more exposed to it, but even at school, promoting that enthusiasm.
So there is research that shows that motivation makes a big difference in the learning lives of our readers. Reading aloud to children is a key strategy that we use right from the beginning. And part of that is to put the literary language in the ears of our children. Part of that is to demonstrate what proficient reading looks like and sounds like. But a big part of that is to expose children to lots of different kinds of texts and to instill in them the joy of reading. We clearly have two goals here. One is children need to be able to read, but children have to want to read. If we produce, if children are skillful at reading and choose not to make reading part of their lives, and we have not been successful. So I would absolutely agree with you.
And those are the kinds of things that you can't capture on a standardized test. But when we look at reading inventories and we look at student interest level and that's why I spoke in the opening about being the difference between being literate and being actively literate. Actively literate is not just you can read, but you choose to read for multiple purposes and audiences, and you have a sense of agency and voice, and that gets at the equity work of this district and our 4 learning cycles. And when we embed literacy into our 4 learning cycles and say academic, social, and physical environments worthy of our children, collaborative conversations alive in every classroom, unlocking the genius of each and every learner so students have a sense of voice and agency and take an active stance in their learning, that's what being truly literate means. And it's not just, okay, here's a reading test, okay, you passed the test and you decoded this many words correctly and you made meaning. It's can we ask our young people, who's your favorite author? Do you have a library card? Do you have 3 books on your nightstand at home? And do you go under the covers at night with the flashlight and read? Those are the kinds of literacy behaviors that we're looking for that don't get captured on a state or national assessment, and yet the state and national assessments are byproducts. You do well on those tests when you can read, but we want so much more than that. So we cast this vision inside our equity work where every one of our young people that we serve is being given conditions where they become passionate readers and writers, because they know that by reading and writing you contribute and you participate more fully in your classroom, in your school, in your community, in the world. And that's the vision that we cast when we cast a vision for literacy.
And I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but I do think that how do you find that out when you look at the data? They tell you a certain group, that's where you get the problem with the African Americans scoring low on tests collectively.
Right.
And so that's why you have to focus some of these intervention strategies that you're talking about to address that, because obviously something is going wrong. If the data show that in response to his question that the reading piece of it, the motivation piece of it, the lack of exposure to certain things is an issue, then the intervention has to be supplying some of those things regardless to what the child comes to the classroom with. We have to find ways to ensure that regardless, they will still meet those needs. And that's...
Which is why I related it back to our learning cycles of academic, social, physical environments worthy of our children, unlocking the genius, opportunities for collaborative conversations, that the literacy work has to live inside that, because a reading assessment, even a classroom-based assessment, doesn't tell you all of the whole child and the whole self that they're bringing to the specific reading task. Lives inside of a whole individual, a whole child, that's inside of school climate and culture that honors and values what the gifts and strengths strengths and talents and ability that they're bringing to us, and it's our work to unlock it. And you're asking Trustee Whitehurst-Payne, how do we know that? If the reading score doesn't tell us that they're reading inventories, there are other ways, and go back to why it's important to give teachers time in school teams to collaborate about their learners. And my my superintendent report this evening was about the National Equity Project and the work that we did just this past week about knowing individual students, putting students at the core of Common Core, knowing our individual students and what they're bringing to us was part of the work that teachers are doing there, and they're actually looking at a specific child and understanding that student, the whole student, not just the score on a test on a day.
I wonder, maybe Superintendent, could you relate this discussion to the discussion that we're having about developing the capacity and confidence of parents to support their students, particularly in these I guess at both the early years and the secondary.
With the work that we were doing with Allison Rowland and looking at Team Family for Equity and looking at what parents can do to be an active participant in growing literate lives, we've identified 3 high leverage strategies for elementary, for middle school, and for high school, and we're building a systemic approach to that so parents can see. One of the high leverage strategies is read with your child at home in whatever language you read in. It doesn't need to be in the language that they're using in school. It can be in the home language. If you're not able to read in your home language, you can tell a story. There are folk stories, there are stories, family stories that are told. That's a form of engaging in literacy, but talking to your child, asking. So we're casting a vision too for the parents' role in creating the literate lives of our children, and that literate lives are beyond just a test, but there's a family component, and literacy starts at home.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions?
We're really excited about where this is going to be taking us and adding a literacy strand to our equity work so that each student is able to have the skills that they need in a context that honors them.
Thank you, Donna and Wendy.
Thank you, Donna and Wendy. Appreciate it.
Great job.
Just as we make a transition, as you were speaking, I was thinking of Michael Fullen's book, Coherence, and I know you mentioned Leading from the Middle, but his new book also talks about the four major right drivers, and I just could click those off: focus and cohesion, and collaboration, and cooperation, and assessment, and assessment from inside outside, with the inside being most important. So and deepening learning is really the one where we left on. We have a whole lot more to talk about.
Dr. McQuarrie and I are participating in the California School Boards Association LCFF collaborative working group that we attend monthly, and we're looking at Michael Fullen's work around the right drivers. And because our state has committed to an LCAP process where we're going to use data and accountability, we're going to reinvent, but we want to use the right drivers, and more importantly, we want to do it in the right way. And so this was an example, tonight's board's report, of how we're going to drive instructional change and improvement. And it's not by set a goal, get a test score, test everybody, and say you did it or you didn't.
Right.
So thank you for bringing in the work that we're doing at the state level, because we're hoping our participation in the CSBA working group is to influence and give input at the state board level when our state is about to make some very difficult decisions around the right drivers that our state will use to know how schools are doing. We want to have actively participate and give voice, so we'll be there next Thursday. We'll be participating in another
And it translates directly to the LCAP, so
absolutely.
we think it's worth good work. And moving on, E2, as we move towards discussing quality schools in every neighborhood, the report on access to a broad and